lives.
Had not taken their lives, what did you think would happen to them? And where did they end up?
Hell.
Tragedy is an understatement.
Postpartum depression and psychosis.
One of the most horrific crimes imaginable.
A lot of media attention, but this is definitely not a new problem.
June 20th, 2001. Houston, Texas. Police sirens approach a home. A woman waits calmly inside. The nation will soon learn her name. They will call her a monster, a murderer, a mother devoid of conscience. But the real story was never told in court. Everything that happened in those final minutes had already been written months before. Written by a psychiatrist who never reviewed critical medical files. Written by a husband who ignored explicit medical warnings. Written by a religious extremist who planted seeds of psychological shame. Written by a system that watched a woman descend into untreated psychosis and chose not to intervene. This is not simply a story about a crime. This is an investigation into how 5 preventable deaths were locked into motion by psychiatric malpractice, spiritual manipulation, and a single catastrophic medical decision made 16 days before tragedy. This case fundamentally changed American mental health law, and the real horror, the systemic collapse that made everything inevitable, happened long before June 20th. To understand what happened to Andrea Yates, you first need to understand who she was before the illness consumed her. Andrea Pia Kennedy was the youngest of 5 children. Exceptional, driven. By high school, she was her class valedictorian and captain of the swim team. She was the girl who had to be perfect, not because anyone forced her to, but because she forced herself. She became a registered nurse at ND Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. Successful, independent, a woman with her own apartment, her own car, her own life. Then, in October 1989, she met Rusty Yates at an apartment swimming pool. He was smitten. She was polite, but not interested. Weeks later, Andrea did something that would reshape everything. She made the first move. She walked up to his apartment and started a conversation. Within months, they were dating. Rusty Yates was an engineer for NASA. Religious, ambitious. On paper, they seemed matched. But there was a third person in this relationship from the beginning, Michael Warnecke. Michael Warnecke was an itinerant evangelist who traveled America preaching a version of Christianity that was absolute, unforgiving, and extreme. In his theology, virtually everyone, even regular church attendees, was destined for hell. Only him, his wife Rachel, and their children had any hope of salvation. Rusty Yates had become his disciple. When Rusty started dating Andrea, the first people she met were the Warneckes. Over the years, Andrea and Rusty would stay with them for weeks. The Warneckes criticized her parenting, her faith, her value as a woman. They gave her a book called Hope for the Flowers that used a metaphor about becoming a butterfly by ceasing to be a caterpillar. To a woman already struggling, the message was clear. To be reborn spiritually, you must fundamentally erase who you were. The Warneckes published newsletters filled with fire and brimstone theology. One section, titled Modern Mother Worldly, described mothers who didn't follow strict biblical discipline as future residents of hell, as Jezebels. Andrea read every word. She internalized every condemnation. A seed had been planted. Andrea and Rusty married on April 17, 1993. But even on her wedding day, Andrea was consumed by shame. She refused to wear a veil because she believed she was impure, that her failure to remain a virgin had tainted her soul. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Her son Noah was born on February 26, 1994. Everything seemed fine at first, but in the weeks after his birth, something shifted inside Andrea's mind. She wasn't sleeping. She was experiencing thoughts she didn't understand. She felt disconnected, watching herself from outside her body. No one recognized what was happening. By the late 1990s, Rusty had made a decision that would trap Andrea in increasingly confined spaces. He sold their house in Texas, moved the family to a trailer park in Florida. Then, after visiting the Warnickes in 1998, he purchased an aging GMC motorhome for $37,000. A 350-square-foot bus, with 4 young children, no privacy, no escape, no support network. In June 1999, after the birth of their 4th son, Luke, Andrea experienced complete psychiatric collapse. She was found in a state of abject crisis, shaking, barely able to speak. She called out, "I need help." Rusty's response: he took the children to the beach. The next day, Andrea took 40 of her father's trazodone pills in a suicide attempt. She was hospitalized for the first time, diagnosed with postpartum depression, given medication, then discharged, with explicit orders from her psychiatrist. She must be watched 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If Rusty couldn't watch her, someone else had to be present at all times. But Rusty downplayed the severity. He called it the baby blues. Andrea, however, knew the truth. She told her doctors repeatedly, "I'm not a good mother." She said this with conviction, as if it was a fact she'd always known. Where had she learned to believe this about herself? In August 1999, Andrea met with psychiatrist Dr. Eileen Starbranch. For the first time in months, there was genuine medical hope. Dr. Starbranch recognized immediately postpartum depression with psychotic features. Severe, dangerous, but treatable. She prescribed powerful antipsychotic medications: Haldol, Effexor, Wellbutrin, Cogentin. On the first day Andrea took these medications, the transformation was remarkable. Rusty told the doctor it felt miraculous. He said he had his wife back. Andrea was sleeping, eating, functioning. Then, during an appointment on August 18, 1999, Andrea delivered news that would change everything. She and Rusty had decided to have more children. They wanted a 5th child. Dr. Starbranch's response was immediate and unambiguous. She explained to both Andrea and Rusty that if Andrea became pregnant again, it was a virtual certainty her psychosis would return. She documented this in her medical notes. Apparently, patient and her husband want to have as many babies as nature will allow, but this will surely guarantee future psychotic depression. Andrea had already attempted suicide twice. She had spent 26 days hospitalized in psychiatric units across 2 separate admissions. She had been diagnosed with severe postpartum depression with psychotic features. And yet, despite this clear, unambiguous medical warning, Rusty Yates agreed to have another child. More troubling, with Rusty's encouragement, Andrea gradually stopped taking her psychiatric medications. The medications that were saving her life. Dr. Starbranch's final entry, dated January 12, 2000, read, "Patient wants to be off meds and less symptomatic. Husband agrees." A line could be drawn directly from this date to June 20, 2001. Everything that would follow was already set in motion. By February 2001, Andrea was pregnant with her 5th child. Off her medications, living in a 350-square-foot bus, with 4 young children, no friends, no support, no escape route. On March 12, 2001, Andrea's father, the one person she was truly close to, died. Her mental state collapsed immediately. She became catatonic. Her legs shook uncontrollably. She scratched her head until it bled. She stopped eating, stopped drinking. She got 2 to 3 hours of sleep per night. Rusty called Dr. Starbranch in a panic. Dr. Starbranch's advice was unambiguous. Andrea needed immediate psychiatric hospitalization at a facility 45 minutes away. Today, not tomorrow. Today, Rusty refused. He said the commute was too inconvenient. Instead of getting his gravely ill wife the emergency psychiatric care she needed, Rusty spent days calling local psychiatrists, begging them to prescribe medications by phone. The same medications he had supported Andrea stopping months earlier. A week passed. Finally, on March 31st, 4 days after Andrea's psychiatric crisis began, she was admitted to Devereaux Treatment Center by court order. When she arrived, the intake notes read, catatonic, selectively mute, severe decline in overall condition. She was not eating or drinking. She was losing weight. She was a woman in acute psychiatric emergency. She was assigned a new psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed. And this is where everything accelerated toward tragedy. Dr. Saeed had all the information he needed to treat Andrea properly. Rusty told him Andrea had a documented history of postpartum depression with psychotic features. She had been successfully treated with Haldol before. Her previous psychiatrist, Dr. Starbranch, had warned explicitly that future pregnancies would trigger relapse. All he had to do was request her previous psychiatric records. He never did. For 13 days, Andrea remained catatonic. She attended group sessions designed for drug and alcohol addiction, a problem she didn't have. There were no postpartum depression groups, no specialized therapy for her actual condition. Then, because her insurance company refused to pay for continued care, Dr. Saeed discharged her after 13 days. She was still profoundly depressed, still catatonic, still not eating properly. Rusty begged him to keep her one more day. Dr. Saeed discharged her anyway. Over the next month, Andrea's condition deteriorated. By early May, she was back to her catatonic state, scratching her head and arms, staring into nothing for hours, refusing to talk. Rusty brought her back to Dr. Saeed. This time, Rusty convinced Dr. Saeed to prescribe Haldol, the medication that had worked before. But Dr. Saeed didn't prescribe it at the effective dose. Instead of 300 milligrams by injection every 3 weeks, he prescribed 2 milligrams twice daily. That was less than 1/3 the effective dose. Andrea remained catatonic, still not eating, still refusing to participate in groups. After 10 days, insurance again refused to pay. Andrea was discharged on May 14, 2001. 5 weeks before the tragedy. She was still profoundly ill, and what came next would be the final piece of the puzzle. On June 4, 2001, exactly 16 days before everything fell apart, Andrea had an appointment with Dr. Saeed. This single appointment would seal the fate of 5 children. When Dr. Saeed examined Andrea, she was still severely depressed, still catatonic, still showing every clinical sign of active psychosis. Her condition had not improved. If anything, it had worsened. But Dr. Saeed made a decision that would later seem incomprehensible. He decided Andrea no longer needed her antipsychotic medications. He had never spoken with Dr. Starbranch, the psychiatrist who had successfully treated Andrea before. He had never conducted clinical testing to verify whether Andrea was actually experiencing psychosis. He simply decided, based on nothing, that she was better. He told Rusty to stop giving Andrea her morning dose of Haldol. Then, 3 days later, he told Rusty to stop the evening dose as well. In psychiatric medicine, there is a fundamental protocol. When discontinuing powerful antipsychotic medications, you taper the dose slowly over weeks or months. You don't stop abruptly. You especially don't do this with a patient who has a documented history of severe psychosis and 2 suicide attempts. Dr. Saeed did exactly that. He took her off the medication cold turkey. But it didn't stop there. 2 days later, when Rusty returned and said Andrea had declined and he was deeply concerned, when he specifically asked about putting her back on Haldol, Dr. Saeed said something shocking. "It's a bad medicine." Then Dr. Saeed made another decision. Instead of the Haldol that had worked, He changed her medications entirely, cold turkey again. He decreased her Effexor from 450 milligrams to 300 milligrams overnight. But he increased her Remeron from 45 milligrams to 60 milligrams. In psychiatric circles, the combination of Remeron and Effexor at high doses is informally known as rocket fuel. It is known to cause severe mania and dangerous disconnection from reality in patients with bipolar disorder and psychotic features, conditions Andrea had been diagnosed with. He had just removed the only medication keeping her tethered to reality and replaced it with a combination known to cause psychiatric destabilization. 2 days before June 20th, Andrea returned to Dr. Saeed's office. The first thing Rusty said, "She's declined. I'm concerned." He asked again about Haldol. Dr. Saeed repeated, "It's a bad medicine." During the trial that would follow, Dr. Saeed would testify that at this moment, he found no evidence that psychosis was playing an important role in Andrea's condition. But Andrea Yates had spent 2 years going in and out of psychiatric hospitals due to her serious mental illness. Later, multiple psychiatrists who would treat her would refer to her as the most severely ill psychiatric patient they had ever encountered. Yet despite Andrea's failing mental health, her catatonic state, her poor hygiene, her lack of eye contact, despite every clinical indicator screaming that she was in absolute crisis, a woman quite literally pleading for help, drive. Saeed looked at Andrea sitting across from him and said, "You need to help me out with a more positive attitude. Chin up." These are the words spoken to a catatonic woman covered in self-inflicted scratches. A woman who had attempted suicide twice. A woman whose mind was fracturing under the weight of untreated psychosis. Chin up. But Dr. Saeed didn't stop there. Just 2 days before everything would happen, he changed Andrea's medications one final time, again, cold turkey. He took her from 450 milligrams of Effexor to 300 milligrams overnight. He raised her Remeron from 45 milligrams to 60 milligrams. Psychiatrists would later describe this as pouring pharmacological rocket fuel into an already diseased and critically ill mind. After 4 different psychiatric hospitalizations, after 2 suicide attempts, after years of documented severe mental illness, after explicit medical warnings about future pregnancies, after months of medication mismanagement, after being taken off her only effective medication, after being given dangerous medication combinations, after being told she needed a better attitude, after all of this, Andrea Yates was given one final instruction by her psychiatrist and her husband. She must never be left alone. The medical record was clear. Every doctor who had treated her emphasized this: 24 hours a day, 7 days a week supervision. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty Yates left Andrea home alone with their 5 children. He had an important meeting at NASA. He believed his mother was on her way to the house and would arrive soon. But she wasn't expected for at least an hour. He left anyway. What happened in that hour would devastate 5 families, traumatize a nation, and fundamentally change American mental health law. But here's what the media never emphasized. Andrea Yates did not decide to kill her children because she was evil. She didn't premeditate this as an act of malice or cruelty. Andrea Yates was profoundly psychotic. She believed her children were destined for hell. She believed she was a bad mother, a belief planted by extremist theology and watered by years of shame. She believed Satan was real and present. She believed the only way to save her children was to act. Every delusion that drove her actions had roots in the preceding 2 years of medical abandonment, spiritual abuse, and professional negligence. Andrea Yates stood trial. The prosecution painted her as a monster, a calculated killer, a disturbed woman who murdered her children in cold blood. But they never told the full story. They never explained Dr. Muhammad Saeed's systematic failures, discontinuing her only effective medication, prescribing dangerous combinations, never consulting her previous psychiatrist, conducting no clinical testing despite her documented history of psychosis. They never explained that Dr. Saeed testified he found no definite indication of psychosis in a patient with a 2-year documented history of postpartum depression with psychotic features. They never explained that Rusty Yates knew his wife had attempted suicide twice and was explicitly told never to leave her alone, and yet he left her alone anyway. They never explained the role of the Warnickes and their extremist theology that convinced Andrea she was a failure, a bad mother, a Jezebel destined for hell if her children weren't saved. The jury found Andrea guilty of capital murder. They declined to sentence her to death, instead imposing life without parole. But years later, after a critical error by a prosecution expert witness was revealed on appeal, Andrea was granted a new trial. This time, she was exonerated of capital murder on grounds of insanity. Nearly 20 years after June 20, 2001, the legal system finally recognized what should have been obvious all along. Andrea Yates was profoundly mentally ill. She was not a calculating murderer. She was a woman failed by virtually everyone who claimed to care about her. Since Andrea's case, mental health awareness has advanced significantly. In 2003, the Texas state legislature passed the Andrea Yates Law, legislation still in place today. It requires hospitals and doctors to inform patients about postpartum depression, its signs, its symptoms, and the critical importance of early intervention. The psychiatric community credits Andrea's case with advancing the study of postpartum depression and psychosis by 50 years. Her tragedy became the catalyst for systemic change. But here's what haunts this case. Andrea Yates is still alive. She lives in a state psychiatric hospital. She will likely never leave. And to this day, there are people who write to her. People who threaten her. People who condemn her. People who have no idea what actually happened. They see a headline. They see 5 dead children. They see a monster. They don't see a woman who was failed by a psychiatrist who never reviewed her medical records. They don't see a husband who chose his career over his wife's safety. They don't see a religious extremist who convinced a vulnerable woman she was a sinful failure. They don't see a system designed to protect the vulnerable that completely collapsed. They don't see a woman who, when given proper psychiatric care, responded immediately. Who became stable, who functioned, who was, at her core, a successful nurse, a dedicated mother, and a loving wife, before the illness and the failures consumed her. The tragedy of Andrea Yates is not isolated. It is a warning signal about a systemic crisis we continue to ignore across America. Right now, children across this nation face unprecedented rates of depression and self-harm. The American Academy of Pediatrics has declared a state of emergency regarding youth mental health. Veterans return from war with shattered minds, PTSD, and severe psychiatric trauma, only to be left homeless on our streets, invisible and untreated. We tell them to chin up, just like Dr. Saeed did. We stigmatize mental illness. We shame those who are struggling. We make it terrifying to ask for help. Women struggling with postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis continue to fall through cracks in a healthcare system that often treats pregnancy as a temporary condition rather than a mental health crisis. Many don't receive proper screening. Many aren't warned about the signs of psychosis. Many are discharged from psychiatric care too early, sometimes, as in Andrea's case, because insurance companies make medical decisions instead of doctors. The case of Andrea Yates reveals something fundamental about our society. We have systems designed to protect the vulnerable. But those systems only work if the people within them choose to do their jobs. Dr. Muhammad Saeed failed to review medical records, a basic standard of psychiatric care. He failed to consult with previous psychiatrists who had successfully treated his patient. He failed to conduct clinical testing to verify psychosis. He failed to recognize psychosis in a patient with a documented 2-year history of psychosis. He failed to recognize that his patient was in acute crisis. And he failed to take seriously a concerned family member who specifically asked for the medication he dismissed. Rusty Yates failed to prioritize his wife's safety over his career advancement. He failed to follow explicit medical instructions to never leave Andrea alone. He failed to recognize that the woman he loved was drowning, or perhaps more troublingly, he saw it and didn't act. The Warnickis failed to show grace, mercy, or compassion when a vulnerable woman needed spiritual support most. Instead, they showed judgment and condemnation. They reinforced shame that would become the psychological architecture of Andrea's delusions. The system failed because people chose not to intervene, not because the tools didn't exist, not because the warning signs weren't there, but because those entrusted with Andrea's care chose, individually and collectively, not to do what was necessary. And 5 children paid the ultimate price. Here's what keeps this case alive 20 years later. Here's what makes medical professionals, legal scholars, and mental health advocates return to the details again and again. A simple, devastating question. If Dr. Saeed had simply done his job, if he had reviewed Andrea's previous psychiatric records during her very first appointment, if he had made one phone call to Dr. Starbranch, if he had conducted even basic clinical testing, if he had prescribed the Haldol at the effective dosage that had already proven successful, how many children would still be alive today? Not one child saved by his competence. Not 2 children. Not 3. 5. All 5 children would still be alive. Noah, John Paul, Luke, Paul, and Mary. These weren't tragic victims of an inevitable mental illness crisis. Their deaths were the direct result of one psychiatrist's decision not to review medical records. One psychiatrist's refusal to make a phone call. One psychiatrist's choice to dismiss the medication that had worked in prescribed combinations known to cause psychiatric destabilization. There is no medical, ethical, or moral justification for what happened. There is no scenario where those children needed to die. Their deaths were not an inevitable tragedy of untreated mental illness. They were the direct result of professional negligence, spiritual manipulation, and systemic failure at every possible level. Andrea Yates deserved better, her children deserved better, and we all deserve a system that actually protects the vulnerable instead of standing by and watching them drown. If you or someone you love is struggling with depression, postpartum depression, intrusive thoughts, or thoughts of self-harm, please don't wait. Reach out for help today. The resources are in the description below. Your life matters. Your well-being matters. And if you see someone drowning in mental illness, truly drowning, be the one who throws a life raft. Be the person Andrea Yates needed. Be the person who listens, who believes them, who takes their suffering seriously. The case of Andrea Yates teaches us something profound. Mental illness is not a moral failing. Compassion is not weakness, and the system we build to protect the vulnerable will be judged by whether it actually protects them. Andrea Yates spent 2 decades in psychiatric care, medicated, stable, and profoundly remorseful. She will never leave, but her case changed mental health law in America. 5 children are gone, but their story became the catalyst for protecting countless others. That is her legacy. Thank you for bearing witness to this story. If it moved you, if it challenged how you see mental illness, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The story of Andrea Yates is one we cannot afford to forget.